Welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today, in our ongoing study in the book of Revelation, we're going to examine some ways in which Roman culture and symbolism play a part in John's vision. I'm excited to do that in conversation with Dr. Shane Wood, the professor of New Testament and its origins at Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri. I listened to his class lectures on Revelation that he put on his website at shanejwood.com. And I found those lectures to be very helpful for my own preparation to teach through the book. He's also written about Rome. It figures prominently in his published dissertation called The Alter Imperial Paradigm, Empire Studies and the Book of Revelation. And partly because of that, I'm eager to connect with him on this topic. So welcome, Dr. Wood, to the Storm of Scripture.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Now, before we get into the actual discussion of Revelation, I'd like just to open the floor to you to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work at Ozark, maybe a little bit about the college.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of fun, exciting things that are happening here. I've been teaching here for about 15 years, but recently over the last like 7 to 8 years, I've been building our master's program, which we just launched 2 years ago, and that's been going great. But I get to teach primarily New Testament, gearing up actually for a history of the Roman Empire course, and but then Revelation, Gospels is kind of my area of expertise here.
It's been a few years since you recorded those online lectures.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across anything different? Would you have tackled any of that information differently? I don't know how long it's been since you've listened to yourself give those lectures.
I think that's actually the first part of my answer would be I'd have to go back and maybe look at those. But right now I'm currently in the middle of finishing up a manuscript on Revelation called Thinning the Veil with IVP, and I'm learning a ton right there that's just kind of been unearthed to me for the first time. So probably I would definitely emphasize quite a few different things just in the study and the unearthing really of John as a particular instead of just seeing him as a bystander, kind of trying to read Revelation through his eyes. So kind of the thing I've been struck with most recently is Revelation 1 begins with John in loneliness. Like he's alone on the island of Patmos, away from his family and away from the familiarity, and kind of tracing the fragility of John throughout the book of Revelation, where he breaks down weeping in chapter 5 at the sight of a scroll. He's just so overwhelmed, and twice he bows down and worships an angel, which is kind of like not John. He does some. If it is the apostle definitely does some brazen things in the gospel, but you don't see him cowering, or you don't, he's the one at the cross. You don't see him not worshiping other entities. So there's something about John at the beginning of the text that I think for me most recently has been shocking to kind of see him as not just an onlooker, but an intricate part, I think, of the heart of the revelation. But that's kind of what's just been captivating my heart and mind so far right now.
I like that. In the lecture that I did, so I teach weekly in class, and so what I've put here on YouTube is my recorded lessons that I do in Sunday school.
Oh, awesome!
So each class is roughly 30 minutes, 40 minutes if I can keep them in the classroom a little bit longer. But I did a lecture a lesson on when John is asked, the elder comes off of his throne and asks John to explain about who are this great crowd of witnesses, which I think is just wonderful that the elder would ask John to explain something in the vision.
Yeah.
And of course, John does not have an answer.
Yeah.
But at that point, he's interacting with the vision. He's a part of the action. He's not an observer, as you said. He's right there in the middle of it.
Yep.
Which is something in common with like Daniel, who also interacted when he has a vision of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. He interacts with one of the attendants there in a very similar kind of way, except the attendant is giving the answers.
Yeah.
to when Daniel asked the question. But it's very interesting that this is not just like watching something on a screen
Hmm.
or being in a completely dream state where everything's sort of happening around you. John's right there in the midst of the action and in fact
Yeah.
taking part of some of it.
Yeah, and that's for me. It's been because of that insight that you just articulated well. That I feel compelled, like I need to get to know John better. There's something about the movement of his heart that I think is a part of the revelation that we can overlook when we get
Hmm.
kind of bogged down with questions that matter, but that ultimately I think are distracting. But yeah, so for me right now, that's what I've been struck with the most is kind of tracing the thread of the person of John throughout the text, and not just the images. Although the images I find to be quite fascinating as well.
Yes. So it's a bit of an emotional revelation as much as an intellectual one,
Yeah.
um, for John.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that says something about who the God is of Revelation. That in John's God is tender with John, even whenever John is in an erratic state, or maybe even an ecstatic state where he is literally outside of himself, just acting beside himself. And yet Jesus comes in Revelation 1 and tenderly reaches out and places his hand on John and says, "Don't be afraid." So for me, I've been saturated in that over the past really like year or so. And I definitely don't think that was the stuff I was emphasizing in the lectures that are online right now.
I don't recall that from listening to it. I've listened to it more recently than you have, probably.
Maybe so.
But let's turn to the main topic at hand, which is
Yeah.
Rome. And you've written so much about it, and it did come up in the lectures that I've been listening to, how
Hmm.
central Rome is. It's something I've been trying to infuse into my lessons as we walk through John in class. But what would you say is the importance of keeping that Roman context in reading and interpreting Revelation?
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails into what we just talked about, but it's easy to forget when we're bogged down in the symbols and the imagery of Revelation to forget this is written to a real people at a real time going through real issues. And the reality of the situation they were in is they were immersed like a fish in the ocean in the Roman world.
Mhm.
The no book is contextualist, but the New Testament in particular, it is written saturated in Roman imagery, culture, oppression. The dynamics of the Roman Empire are infused into every verse of the New Testament. I mean, Jesus was executed by a Roman governor on a Roman cross, which made a Roman statement. And Revelation is no different. It is dripping with Rome. As a result, then there is a natural dialogue that is occurring between the text and between the empire, even if the text itself isn't directly speaking to Rome. And I know that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but there are times that the text does directly speak to Rome. It confronts it. There are other times, though, that it is using the grammar that Rome has provided as a part of a greater dialogue that Rome is, though, a part of, even if Rome doesn't want to be a part of. So for me, when it comes to Rome and Revelation, I mean, I would expand it to the New Testament, but for our conversation here, Rome and Revelation, you cannot understand the revelation to the seven churches without understanding the dynamics, the contours of Rome and what Roman culture brings to the wrestling of Revelation.
What are some ways in which interpretations have gone wrong
Hmm.
because they failed to consider the Roman context?
Yeah. Yeah, and to me, that's one of the important parts of studying Roman context too, is it tethers us to the first century. It's the anchor point. And the way in which a lot of the times, and I understand this because what's the word? Because the text is quite confusing because it's unfamiliar. The imagery can be overwhelming because we're not discipled in that way of thinking or talking. Like you brought up Daniel, like the Jews of the first century, and therefore the Judeo-Christian perspective would have been discipled by Daniel. And the
Mhm.
last half of his book is not just celebrated, but it is referenced multiple times in the New Testament. And the last half of his book is not Daniel in the lion's den. It's not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It is beasts coming out of the sea and horns that are moving and talking and interaction with angels, like you mentioned. And it would have been familiar to them. What typically happens, though, because we're unfamiliar with this way of processing reality, we then download how we are familiar with processing reality, and we start, and this is natural. We try to find ourselves in the text, but the danger is at times we hijack the text from the first century, bringing it into the 21st century, so that we can, in some sense, bring meaning into our own lives. And here's what I usually challenge my students. I say, listen, God is concerned about you in the 21st century as well, but we don't need to hijack the first century text. We don't need to divorce it from their setting in order for us to have meaning. We actually can enrich our meaning by keeping it in the first century first and allowing then the messages that we're overhearing, the conversation we get to overhear in the text, to then be brought to us via the actual context of the document. So the interpretations that go awry, I actually appreciate their heart, but what they're doing is they're saying, how do I find meaning now? So in the 1970s, Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, trying to find meaning in the 70s. Well, Apache helicopter was a pretty big deal around that time,
Yeah.
because of the Vietnam War and because of the different ways in which things were fighting. And so he looks into Revelation 8 and 9 with the trumpets and the locusts that have this hair coming down, and he sees something in that time, the 20th century, reflected in the first century, and therefore he builds the bridge of meaning that he longs to have from the text. I would say through hijacking the text.
Yeah.
And it's just unnecessary. We don't need to hijack the text in order for it to give us meaning. And focusing on that Roman aspect keeps us tethered to that context.
That's true. I was just reading a commentary that one of my class members had shared with me. It was written back in the 1940s,
Hmm.
and he was making connections with the atomic bomb.
Okay.
This was like late 40s, 1948. So post World War II,
Yeah.
and the bomb and all. And so he was finding the connection to something that was recent history to him,
Mm-hmm.
the bomb going off in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and connecting that with the text.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, well, mass destruction is addressed in the text, but
Sure.
not nuclear bombs per se, or
Right.
Apache helicopters per se.
Yep. And the thing is this is human nature. Like the same undercurrent can be found whenever somebody is driving, let's just say, up in the Northwest, and they come across this mountain that they think looks like a face.
Mhm.
Now, it's one of those things where I go, it's natural for us to try to actually find meaning in everything we encounter, and at times even to see ourselves, because ultimately what we are looking for is the image of God that is in us, that sin is wrapped around. So the same idea of looking at a mountain and seeing a human is the same thing that we're finding there. You're looking for meaning. You're looking for affirmation that you matter. And the way that we do it with the biblical text, and this has happened for 2,000 years. This is like, I point out to my students, I'm like, this idea that, this freaking out that the world's going to end. I'm like, in the end of the 900s, when they were coming on the first century or the first millennium of this new calendar system centered on Christ, there were there were a lamb that was born with two heads, and there were some ecological upheaval, and there was some astrological phenomenon. And what did they do? They started preaching and teaching that the world was ending, and
Yeah.
then it didn't. And this is where I go, okay, so we see a commonality, but it's a part of something of what it makes us to be human. We're looking for meaning, specifically direct meaning about us, that we're looking for God's pursuit of us in everything that we're engaging, whether it be the text or creation. I just find it to be a methodology that I empathize with, but it's not one that I think is very productive or fruitful for biblical studies.
Oh, I I agree and totally with what I've seen in studying through the text. In my lessons, I'm trying to always keep it very current. One of the things you said in your first or maybe second lecture, that was that if the meaning we find, if the interpretation we have doesn't give some meaning and hope to the seven churches in John's day,
Yeah.
then it really can't be right. It can't, because it was written to them. If it doesn't have some meaning to them and hope for
Mhm.
them, then it doesn't, it just doesn't connect.
Absolutely. It's the same thing we're doing here. I mean, it's the same thing you do whenever you teach. I mean, you're assuming that what you're doing has meaning for the audience you're speaking to. And John
Yeah.
is very clear, Revelation very clear is saying and especially in the first three chapters, although it's I had somebody say this to me, and this is a pretty common rapture theory evidence, is that I was talking in a setting on end times, and we brought up Revelation 4, and I said this is one of their big rapture texts where it says come up here. So the problem is it's speaking to John in the vision, and John goes up there, but you'd have to ignore all the pronouns, and you'd have to really completely dislodge it from John in order to make that the church. Well, the question was then asked to me, but does the church, isn't it true that the church the word church never appears after chapter 3? And from chapter 4 to 22. And my response was, first of all, that is true. But I was like, but to suggest that John, if he doesn't keep saying the word church, that he's not talking to the church, is like me saying, because I haven't said your name yet, that I'm not talking to you right now. Like, I was like, that's not the way that, like, if Paul doesn't say Timothy every other verse, is he not talking to Timothy anymore? Like, at
Right.
that point, when we dislodge it from this context that John is speaking to the seven churches, you're totally right. He is assuming that what he is saying is meeting their pastoral needs. He is assuming that as a good minister, when he is speaking these images, writing them down, that it is actually either convicting them, comforting them, or compelling them to something in their first century context. So to hijack it, pitch it as all something in the very future that is distant from them, has nothing to do with them, is a I'm using my words very carefully here. It's I understand it, but it's misguided. And I will say this: ultimately, it can become quite dangerous, because I tell my students all the time, if you take the Bible out of context, you can make the Bible say anything you want. And we can see that, and it's kind of like not that big of a deal. Sometimes it's just like, almost cute. I'm having this, whatever procedure or something. And I'm like, I grab this text, and sometimes that's actually like helpful. But whenever you take it, I mean, the Bible has been taken out of context to justify things like genocide, to
Uh,
justify things like slavery. Like, keeping it in context, though, I never see Jesus, what's the word? Giving rubber stamps on that type of action. And so whenever you keep it in the context, and this is what I always say, but if you keep the Bible in its context, it might actually transform you. You might be the one that's actually put on the dissecting table.
all right.
So yeah, so this conversation about Rome, I don't find to be ancillary, or I don't find it to be inconsequential. I find it to be the work of us of trying to understand the message John was actually saying, so that we can get good application, not so that we can avoid it.
Well, exactly. So once we understand its original context and the message that it was to those churches and the people in those seven churches, we can understand how it was helping them and encouraging them, and see the principles that gave them hope. So,
Mhm.
and see how then us as their spiritual descendants, as the next generation, we can say, okay, this is how it gave them hope. I can see that the principle still is true today. The
Yep.
principle that God will judge the wicked, that he will protect the righteous, that he is honoring the deaths of those who die in his name.
Mm,
To me, that's what the fifth seal. It came up
mm,
powerfully to me as I was studying through it this time, which was really, this is the first time. that I've gone verse by verse through the book of Revelation
Mm.
with this text. But it was just so powerful to me. The reason that those saints or the martyrs are at the foot of the altar is because, as I understand it, that's where the blood of the sacrifices was poured
Yeah.
in the temple.
Yeah.
That was the blood that was the atoning blood that was
Hmm.
put on the things that were holy. And then after it was put on the horns of the altar and sprinkled before the throne,
Hmm.
at the Ark of the Covenant, then it was poured out, the rest of it, at the base of the altar. That was the blood. And there's a passage in
Hmm.
Leviticus that just describes that whole process for the Day of Atonement. And I see that so powerfully in Revelation, and that the base of the altar is certainly no disrespect. As a modern reader in our modern culture, we think, oh yeah, they're underneath this piece of furniture. That's kind of like, what are you doing with people down there? And we see it as a bad thing, but it was actually the opposite when we put it in the context. That was where the holy blood uh, of the sacrifice was poured out, and that's where it was, and was at the sacrifice. And the vision is saying, look, these martyrs who have died in relationship with me, out of because of their faith in me, they died. I That is some of the most sacred blood
Hmm.
on earth, because they died honoring me. And so
Hmm.
that's the message that I took away from the fifth seal, and
Yeah.
putting it in its original context makes that make sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's one of those things where that then, it's why I talk to there's a couple things with that passage, but the martyrs as a whole in Revelation is, but it's not something that we're called to seek. We're called to be faithful to the point of death. But martyrdom in the first century was a gift that John himself was not able to receive. John, multiple times, according to church tradition, they attempted to kill him, for
Yeah.
him to become a martyr, and it just didn't work. Like, John is the only disciple that we know, according to church tradition, died of old age. And yet you're right. In Revelation, there is this beautiful way of describing the Christian walk that is not metaphorical, that is actual, in the sense of, take up your cross and follow me. Some of the martyrs actually did that.
Mm-hmm.
Their sacrifice unites with Christ's sacrifice as the means by which we overcome the dragon, Revelation 12:11. And that's one of the things I will also say that I just wrote on that passage last week, and I was struck by, I think Revelation is beautiful enough in the imagery to allow certain figures to get things wrong, even though they're honored. So John bowing down and worshiping an angel, he gets it wrong, but he's clearly honored, and the text corrects it. The martyrs under the altar, fascinatingly, they cry out for vengeance. And the thing I find fascinating is, and again, this goes to first century culture, the very next phrase is, they are handed a white robe. Well, the fascinating thing is in Rome, white robes were always a symbol of a victory in a battle. You've already won. And that's a part of God's response to them. He goes, I understand what you're looking for, vengeance. But you have to understand from the perspective of the cross that your blood is now mingled with at the base of the altar. You've already won. And the rest of Revelation is showing that the victory comes from whenever Christians are willing to go to even the point of death the way Christ did in order to target the true enemy. And that is Satan. And that for me right there is kind of the way in which Rome at times is brought into a dialogue that they don't want to be a part of. They didn't ask to be a part of. And yet that imagery of the white robe allows us to understand that from Rome's perspective, the way to deal with oppressors bent on conquest, the first horseman, that come and take away peace, the second horseman, destroying economies, third horseman, and then ultimately bringing death. The way you do that is in Rome is to just attack those same people. And that's where the martyrs are actually discipled in the grammar of Rome. Where's our vengeance? And the handing of the robe, and then the follow-up saying, more of you need to die. God is actually reorienting even the martyr's perception of how victory is found in Revelation, because The true enemy is not Rome, no matter what Rome says. The true enemy has always been bigger than Rome. So Rome's grammar is being used in order to really decentralize Rome and to put it on Satan himself, which I find to be just this beautiful. Now, at times, Revelation directly confronts Rome. Like there are images and there are moments where it's like, oh no, Rome, like Revelation chapter 1 with, Jesus holding the 7 stars, like the RIC, the Roman imperial coinage. There's this a catalog called RIC. RIC 153 is this coin of Domitian, and his son is sitting on a globe holding 7 stars. Like there is a direct dialogue there where it's going and actually around it says the son of the divine one is what it says on the coin. Well, the son of the divine one, or the son of God, is Christ, and he is holding 7 stars. So there are moments where Revelation is in direct confrontation with Rome, and yet there's other moments where it grabs Roman imagery and pulls it in to speak to something that is far bigger than Rome could ever imagine to be. But yeah, the martyrs is a great example of this first century colliding with, frankly, even some of our 21st century tendencies. And I think Revelation is a good prophetic book in the sense that it is always confronting its reader to do something different, to change, to respond with repentance.
I really see the transition between chapter 11 and 12 as that message that this is bigger than Rome. I'm working through a hypothesis in my lessons right now that chapters 6 through 9 most particularly, but basically this whole middle section about the seals and then the trumpets is using Rome. It's promising to those martyrs that were unsealed in the 5th seal that God is going to punish Rome, and that the trumpets are the implementation of punishment on Rome as an example of God's punishment on empire generally, to any empire and to any wicked oppressor. But with Rome as the primary context and the primary focus of that section. But then with the new vision of the dragon and the woman and the stars in the beginning of chapter 12, things are bigger. It's like, yeah, okay, this is why John is given the scroll. John, I'm thinking that the scroll that the Lamb is holding, that is sealed at the beginning of chapter 5, is the scroll that is unscrolled and in the giant angel that appears after this 7th trumpet and is standing on the land and the sea. That is, I think, the same scroll. I think this is all informed by Ezekiel's vision, who was also brought to eat a scroll. And John is told to eat the unsealed scroll there at the end. I think ever since he saw the scroll in chapter 5, because so much of the imagery of the whole throne scene is taken right from Ezekiel 1 and 2, the elements of the creatures with many faces, and the whole scene unfolds. It whole looks just like Ezekiel's vision. I think when John comes into this context and then sees a scroll in the hands of the one on the throne, the next thing is, okay, well, that's my message. That's for me to take and eat, like Ezekiel ate his, and then I'll give him a message. But he's not able to do that because the scroll is sealed, of course. And then, even after it's unsealed, he's not given the scroll. Instead, the trumpets blast. But then after the last trumpet blasts, the scroll is unsealed, and then he is told to go take this scroll, and now it's time to eat it. So what the scroll is trying to say is something about something bigger and more than everything that's transpired so far. And what is that message? Well, that's what begins in chapter 12, because it's bigger than Rome. It's bigger than our current troubles. It's about a cosmic struggle between the dragon and the woman and her children,
Mm-hmm.
which is ultimately her child, is Jesus, and
Mm-hmm.
then the followers of him. So I think that the whole last movement is saying judgment upon a particular place and time will happen, but we're looking forward to the ultimate judgment that is going to resolve this whole spiritual dynamic between good and evil, between God and the uh, rebel Satan, the dragon. And that's what we're ultimately moving towards to resolve.
Yeah, and I think we end in the same spot. As far as I do think you're right. I mean, I think that the first 11 chapters, and this is obvious from the fact that Satan he's in the complete background in the first 11 chapters. He's mentioned a couple of times, but more in passing in chapters 2 and 3 with the synagogue of Satan, 2:9, 3:9.
Right. And the
This,
throne of Satan.
yeah, the throne of Satan, but he's background. And I would say, and the reason why is because John's meeting the churches where they're at. One of the things you need to do whenever you're ministering to people is to find what is most clearly blocking their vision, and you need to address that first. And Rome is the thing that is the closest to the purview of the first century church, that they can't even get past it. Even the martyrs themselves can't get past Rome. That's where I think the four horsemen are very clearly speaking about Rome. And now I think that you can extrapolate it out into empires and, frankly, the way in which war has functioned throughout the last couple thousand years. But to say that they're, an emperor bent on conquest that comes to take away Pax, which is like a central Roman theme, that their wars are there to bring peace. And yet, the question is, though, that typically you need to ask from the first century is peace from whom's perspective?
Right.
From the perspective of the one that's under the sword, or the one holding the sword? But then, and even the way in which the economy, the third horseman, the way that it articulates the effects of the economy is that the poorest of the poor aren't able to meet their daily needs, the barley for a day's wages, but the oil and the wine, luxury, or the rich don't touch it. So in other words, these wars bent on conquest that Rome is using to take away peace is actually privileging the rich and then bringing death and destruction. And so the first four horsemen, especially when you have the rider on the white horse, which is I keep it divorced from Jesus in 19. I think Jesus is actually using it later to say a different message. But Domitian himself in the Roman triumphal procession in 71 CE, he was riding on a single white horse. It's an image of victory. It's an image of dominance. And so, without question, then the question then becomes, okay, well, in light of this, what happens to Christians when the fifth seal breaks and you see the result of these trampling four white horsemen, or these four, not white horsemen, these four horsemen, and it's Christians that are being killed? The natural question is when are we going to get ours? Now, here's what I find fascinating, is that you see this thread that goes from the image of the slain lamb in chapter 5, and it goes all the way to the end of 11, like you're talking about. Definitely, the mighty angel in chapter 10, in between the sixth and the seventh trumpet, he's holding the scroll, but the way he's described is pulling from images of chapter 1, chapter 4, showing that he clearly is connected to God. John, though, this is coming right off of the trumpets. And the fascinating thing on the trumpets, and this was what I was writing last week too, that I'm blown away by, is even though the trumpets look like, and they are, judgment scenes, there is a different thread that seems to be being pulled in the text. And that is the judgment scenes. First of all, they mirror some of them, not as much as the bowls, but several of them mirror the Exodus. In the Exodus, the goal was not to punish Pharaoh. It was to get him to repent, to let his people go. That was the goal. It took 10, God gave Pharaoh and the Egyptians 10 opportunities to turn around. And yet they would not relent. And this is why I find it fascinating. There's several different threads here. One is wormwood. When wormwood comes down in chapter 8 as the star, there's actually a play on words in the Greek, because wormwood literally means bitter, and it turns the waters bitter. and they drank the water and it poisoned them because it was bitter. The thing that's fascinating is wormwood was a medicinal herb in the ancient world.
Right.
Like Hippocrates even was saying you should take wormwood to kill the parasites in the gut that the water produces. So we have this situation where medicinal herb is added to the water and it actually poisons people as opposed to heals them. Something's not right. So then what happens is then you see this star comes, the key from Revelation 1 and Revelation 3 that Jesus secures at the death and the resurrection. It is given to this star who unlocks hell. He unlocks the abyss. And what's fascinating is that hell immediately attacks their own. Hell goes and tortures them. And God even literally says, I'm going to prevent you from being able to kill your own. Like now God's going, I am going to allow you to see who you have bowed your knee to as clearly as possible. I'm going to give them the authority. And whenever they are unlocked, you even realize the abyss is a movement of grace, of God keeping evil from its own. Because when evil is unleashed, it goes and tortures its own. And after this torturing's happening in verses 5 and 6, it says that they looked for death. They were in such agony. They sought death, who was their master. Death we saw at the fourth horseman, because that was and the rider on the fourth horseman's name was Death, and Hades was following close behind him. But they look for death, and it says, and they could not find him. They sought death, but death eluded them. Why? Because evil in its character only knows how to abandon its own, not how to pastorally meet them. And yet, verses 20 and 21 of chapter 9, it says, even after all of this, they still did not repent, which I think is the purpose of the trumpets. Mm-hmm. It is not punitive. It's actually a call to repentance. I'm going to unveil evil so that you can see who you bowed your knee to. And even still, they refuse. Now, here's what's fascinating. Even though they refuse, chapter 10 is you're exactly right, parallels Ezekiel, the ingesting, where the message and the messenger become one. But the command at the end of chapter 10, right before the two witnesses of 11, is, I want you to go and prophesy again, to do it again, to say what again? The message of the slain lamb. And that's why the two witnesses so clearly parallel the ministry of Jesus, where they speak, they do their ministry, and then they are killed in the city that our Lord was killed, Jerusalem. And then for 3.5 days, their bodies are, not, well, in this sense, not buried, but then they resurrect, and then they go to heaven in a cloud. And here's what's crazy. In chapter 11, verse 13, after creation responds to the two witnesses in this earthquake, it is the only time in the whole book of Revelation where evil repents and gives glory to God. Here's why I find that everything. Now I'm going to combine what you said and what I said and say we end in the same spot. What they are trying to do is to say, I'm going to start right here by looking at Rome, first 11 chapters, but I'm going to be putting things into place to let you know the goal isn't to destroy Rome. It's actually, the way I said it in the book the other day was, there are two ways to obliterate your enemy. You can kill them, or you can convert them into a friend. And it's the second one that is this undercurrent in the first 11 chapters that the martyrs don't even seem to get. But whenever you then get to chapter 12 and it zooms out, now you're right, you have this woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, who then this dragon in verse 3 tries to devour her child, who in verse 5 we see is Jesus. And then there's this fight in heaven in verses 7 through 9. It's the hymn of verses 10 through 12, though, that starts to, first of all, clarify, but then it starts to set the stage for the next 10 chapters. In chapter 10, verse 11, it says, they overcame the dragon, or Nikao, which is where we get the English word Nike, victory. It's in chapters 2 and 3. Those who overcome, they overcame the dragon by the blood of the Lamb, Revelation chapter 5, and by the testimony of the saints that would not shrink from death. How do you overcome? This is where the martyrs, this is where it's going to be like yes and no. How do you overcome the dragon? By being willing to be killed for your enemy. And that's right. Where it's like, well, that makes no sense. It doesn't in the first 11 chapters whenever Rome is in center. But how do you kill an enemy that you cannot swing a sword at? How do you kill Satan? How do you destroy the unholy Trinity? And the answer is you convert your friends into, or your enemies into your friends, the way that Christ did for us when he died for us on the cross, Romans 5. So but here's the thing that, I'm sorry, I'm getting real excited. And if you need me to shut up and ask a different question, just tell me. The thing is, though, is that Rome doesn't drop out of the narrative in the last 10 chapters. It moves into a different position than it maintained the first 11. Because once we get to chapter 17 with the great prostitute who is sitting on 7 hills, if you would have said a woman sitting on 7 hills in the first century, everyone would have said Rome.
Yeah.
Why? 7 hills of Rome. Even on coins, 7 hills, a short way of referring to Rome is the city of 7 hills. I mean, like it is as easy as me saying, America. Like there's North America and there's South America. But when you say America in this context, everybody knows what you're talking about. Or you say the red, white, and blue. Like
Right.
7 hills is not, it's not even code language. It would be as simple as somebody saying, I pledge of allegiance. Like, the context. And it's a woman. Well, Roma is the goddess of Rome. It's what Rome is named after, Roma. But I actually think there's something else happening in 17 that brings Rome front and center. So every empire has a foundational myth. And I don't mean myth necessarily in the sense of false, although people can claim it's false, but it explains their existence. It explains where they came from. We all have this in our families, our family mythologies of, okay, how did my parents meet? And it's not fake. It's the story of origin. It's where we all came from. Rome had their own. Rome's story goes back to 753 BCE, where you have these warring brothers, Amulius and Numitor, and they're fighting over this land. And eventually Amulius demotes Numitor, takes his daughter, makes her a Vestal Virgin. Well, all Vestal Virgins are supposed to be perpetually virgins. And if not, they're supposed to be killed. Well, it finds out she's pregnant. Now, we find out later in the story that she gets pregnant by Mars, the god of war, coming down on her and raping her. Well, she's then pregnant with 2 sons. They put them as a way of punishing her. Instead, they put her into exile instead of killing her. They take the 2 sons, put them in a box, throw them in the Tiber River. Well, a she-wolf pulls them up out of the Tiber River onto the base of the Palatine Hill and suckles them back to health. And this is a key image in Roman imagery of a she-wolf and 2 babies underneath suckling under. It's bringing in the imagery of their foundational myth. Now, here's what's fascinating. The word lupa in Latin means she-wolf and prostitute. And I think the reason why in Revelation 17, he says, I'm going to show you the destruction of the great prostitute, lupa in Latin. I think he's bringing in the imagery of their foundational myth to talk about Rome's destruction. So it's not that Rome is, because what ends up happening is then you have Rome ends up having 7 kings who are then eventually replaced by 10, which becomes the Senate. And ultimately, the Senate is the one that even attacks Rome itself until another king comes and sets them up. And if you trace that imagery in Revelation 17, it's almost verbatim what happens. These 10 kings with this like mind, they go after, the 6 kings who were, but one that is and one that isn't. And then it actually has this 8th one who was one of those. Like, it's grabbing the 7 kings at the beginning of Rome from 753 to 509, bringing in Augustus, who will be the end of the 10, but bringing in the 10 to judge Rome. What's it doing? Taking the foundational myth of Rome, the story of their foundation, and reinterpreting it as the means through which Rome is destroyed. Why? Rome is not the center of the narrative anymore, but it doesn't mean they're not a part of it. Rome, though, has a different location. Rome thinks that they own the sphere, but Revelation 12 and following reveals you have this unholy trinity, the Satan and his two beasts, which each mirror the sun, this beast from the sea, and the Holy Spirit, the beast from the earth. They have their will manifested on earth through a people or a woman or a city. In Revelation, there are 2 women. You have the bride of Christ, you have the great prostitute. You have 2 cities, the New Jerusalem, Babylon. Each of them are the manifestation of the will of the Trinity they belong to. Either the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, or the unholy Trinity, Revelation chapter 12 and 13. Therefore, Rome is a part of this, but Rome collides with the Christians because they are the natural outworking of the unholy Trinity's will. And Revelation's strategy is this: instead of attacking Rome, because if Rome leaves, guess what? The unholy Trinity will find another Babylon to take their place. Revelation strategy is, instead of attacking Rome, what if we attacked the unholy Trinity as a whole? They overcame the dragon by the blood of the Lamb, testimony of the saints. I think you're dead on, though. I think the first 11 chapters have Rome front and center because that's where we begin the context of the seven churches. But in chapter 12 and following, it zooms out, but it doesn't zoom out so far that Rome is uninvolved.
I've been thinking that maybe, and I haven't gotten this far in my own verse by verse thinking through it yet. But chapter 17 is sometimes called an interlude. I said in my introduction at the beginning of this series that I was going to avoid interludes. I think that's my general gut feeling, is that when you say something is an interlude, it means that you don't know how it connects to what came before it or after it. But that's not the text's fault.
Yeah.
So I really dismiss with interludes as a general rule, although I do think that there are some things that are out of chronological order, but that's not quite the same as saying we just bracket this whole thing and treat it as if it's just completely different.
Yeah.
But what if I think that since the beginning of chapter 12, the vision has been focused on the eternal conflict between the dragon and God and his representative through the woman and her son. But it's about this thing and about the ultimate end, because that beast, those beasts that are brought forth in chapters 12, 13 are then thrown into the fire, and there's continuity where it's that beast that's then thrown into the eternal fire, and then we have the ultimate end. So I think we see that ultimate end unfolding through those last few chapters, but then there's that point where one of the elders, or no, this time it's one of the angels with a bowl, isn't it, who comes to John and say, let me show you what's up with this beast. And then they go separate and they look at this beast as kind of as if for the first time the beast rises from water, and then there's the woman on that beast, but it's clearly the same beast, and yet we're talking about it in this like aside. I'm thinking that that's a flashback from what we've been going to the ultimate end of things. But the whole point of the beast, the whole point of a beast that echoes the beasts of Daniel, Daniel
7.
Is it 7? Yes, 7.
Yeah.
Where there's the 4 beasts that come forth, and clearly the beast from Revelation 12 is or 13, the beast from the sea, is the same beast, although now all amalgamated together as one creature instead of 4.
Yeah, the fourth beast of Daniel 7 would probably link up with the Revelation 13 one. Yeah.
Right. Well, but even the beast of Daniel of Revelation, the beast from the sea has the wings. It has elements of like all 4 of Daniel's visionary beasts.
Yeah.
I think.
No, it does. The fourth beast in Daniel's vision is this such grotesque amalgamation of things that there's nothing to compare it to.
Right.
So it's almost
not
like
called a bear or a leopard. It's just a beast.
Right. Yeah, that's where it's like they almost, in a sense, come back into Revelation 13's image from the beast from the sea. Yeah.
But I think the point of the symbolism and of echoing the Daniel symbolism in Revelation is that this is a beast that has cropped up time and again. It is the beast of imperial power that is oppressive in its nature and is destructive. I think that it's erroneous to say that the dragon calls forth the beast. All it says is that the dragon is on the beach, and then the beast appears, arises out of the water. It doesn't say the dragon calls the beach, or the dragon calls the beast, or creates the beast, or I think he's just taking advantage of the beast that arises out of the water. But it arises in human history time and time again. That was the point of Daniel's beasts, that these were four successive empires that were going to rise and destroy. And here we just have one more. But eventually there will be some empire that will eventually be the last one, and it will get thrown into destruction. But in chapter 17, I think it's like a flashback to the current empire. Again, here is the beast now, the beast that we're dealing with again. So I think that's why maybe in Revelation 17, Rome again, there's so many callbacks to Rome.
Yeah.
And
I think, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
do you think the woman, and you will start to wrap up here, I know we're getting close to the end of our time.
Sure.
Do you think the woman has any connection to Jerusalem?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so that is the common question. The reason why is because there are multiple times in the Old Testament where Jerusalem is referred to as a prostitute, even envisioned in some of the prophetic works. I don't think it's inappropriate to see an echo there, but I think that the most direct referent is Rome, and this is where I would make a distinction here. Is that John takes the Old Testament texts, but then he allows Jesus's context to reshape them into a revelation of Christ. So, for example, with the beast of Revelation 13, it is clearly hearkening back to Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, they are successive kingdoms. The interesting thing, though, is if we only had the beast from the sea, then it's a one-to-one. When the beast from the earth comes, all of a sudden it goes, now that's different. Something's shifting. Because Daniel does not have a beast from the earth. And so people at times have said, well, like that's like Job's Leviathan and Behemoth. And I'm like, that's fine. You can explain why there's now two beasts, but you can't explain why he started with Daniel and then morphed it. He didn't need to morph anything if he was trying to make the beast equal Rome. What he's doing there then is he's saying this is connected to Rome, but it's bigger than Rome. And that the reason why this is significant is because in 17, there are two characters. One is that scarlet beast, which you've mentioned. It clearly is pulling from 13, and yet it is a little different, and we don't know exactly why. But then there is the prostitute riding on the beast. And the prostitute that's riding on the beast is the one that at the end of 17 is destroyed, and that chapter 18 is celebrating. But then the beast itself is not destroyed until 19, which tells me that even though there's a connection between the beast and the prostitute, they cannot be one and the same. So you have, if Rome is clearly the prostitute, then Rome cannot fully satisfy the imagery of the beast, even though it's connected to it. The beast is pointing to something beyond. And that's the reason why you have the dragon and two beasts, that the first one parallels the Son, second one parallels the Holy Spirit. They are these unholy or holy trinities that manifest their will on earth. The prostitute is the manifestation of the unholy trinity's will on earth. And that in the first century would have been Rome. The imagery of her has been brought in other situations, for example, with Jerusalem and things like that. But that's also why her name Babylon on her head is so important. It's because it's saying we've seen this before. But if she destroys, it gets destroyed, even, which I find fascinating in chapter 17, she's actually destroyed by her own. Evil destroys
That's
evil.
why I was wondering, to me, that sounds like Rome's destruction of Jerusalem. Like Jerusalem has been in cahoots with Rome for a long time, with Roman approved kings and leaders, and yet Rome destroys Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And so to me, the description of the beast destroying the prostitute sounds like that.
Yeah, I mean, if the prostitute wasn't sitting on seven hills, if she wasn't seven kings, that's where I'm going. Like, I can see where people can get the Jerusalem one, but for me, the imagery is so clearly saturated with Rome. I'd have to ignore too many Roman echoes of the prostitute, especially even the way that she celebrated her death in chapter 18 with the merchants of the earth. And for me, what I see is how I interpret it is the dragon and the two beasts form an unholy trinity, and the prostitute is the manifestation, and that is Rome in the first century, and Rome's destruction. So you actually see 12, 13, 14. You see chapter 12, the unholy trinity, and chapter 13 are brought about. Chapter 14 is where we get Babylon coming to the foreground. Then 15, 16, it's not an interlude, the bowls, but it is this center of the chiasm, because chiasm being, Jewish parallelism, A, B, C, yeah. Then there's D, and then D repeats C, B, and then A. You have the dragon. He is brought in 12. Well, the dragon's the last one destroyed in 20. The two beasts were brought about in 13. Well, the two beasts are the second to the last ones destroyed in 19, 11 through 21. Then you have Babylon 14. Well, Babylon is destroyed in 17 and 18 into the beginning of 19. And then in the very center, you have the bowls, which says what? The way in which we deal with all that is happening is by what we do. We get out there and we witness. So Jesus's interjection in between the sixth and the seventh bowl, where he says, behold, I'm coming soon, and make sure I'm coming like a thief, he says, and make sure I find you fully clothed and not naked, which the woman will be naked in 17. And the clothing in 19 is the righteous acts of the saints. So what you have is you have this beautiful imagery of, we understand this is cosmic, two unholy trinities, that it is manifesting its will on earth through this Babylon imperial force, Rome. But the center is how we actually deal with it. And the center of this parallelism is the bowls saying, get out there and witness. Get out there by what you're doing. So how do we respond to this whole situation? With the blood of the Lamb and with the testimony of the saints that would not shrink from death. That's how we fight Rome. And that's what the martyrs in the fifth seal didn't totally get. They were looking for a methodology would actually not perpetuate Christ's kingdom, but Satan would just get another Babylon.
That's true. If we co-opt their methods, we co-opt their results. We become them.
That's a great way of saying that.
Well, I wanted to parrot off that a little bit. Back when we were talking about the 144,000 and then the great crowd that comes after it, one of the things that strikes me about the 144,000 that's not often commented on, but I think is good, is that they're counted off. The whole point of the repetition, 12,000 from this tribe, 12,000 from this tribe, is that it's a military census. Yeah. It parallels very much the Numbers chapter 1, yep. Where they're doing that. And the reason they take the census is for all of the men who are ready to fight.
Yep.
So here we have a military census, but then the next scene is of the great crowd in white robes. And if you say right. That the white robes are victory, mm-hmm. Then we see like the beginning of the process where the 144,000 are being sealed, prepared for the struggle to come. But then we immediately see them victorious before the throne in white robes. But we never see the army of God in destruction, causing destruction, never fighting, never harming. In fact, I think that is the key. When the 144,000 reappear in the second half, they are on the mountain with the Lamb.
Yeah.
All they're doing is learning a praise song from the choirs of heaven, and they're the only ones who can learn that song. But that's how they fight. They fight by following the Lamb and praising the Lord.
Yep. And there's actually 3 times at the end too in Revelation 16, 19, and 20 where there's a gathering of evil for war, but there is no battle. And that's where Revelation 19:13, Jesus comes to this battle, but his robe is already dipped in blood, which should not be. But the reason why his robe already dipped in blood is because it's the symbol of the battle that has already been won. He won it on the cross. And you brought up 14 with 144,000. It literally says they followed the Lamb wherever he went. And where did he go? And that's why I think right after the image of the 144,000, we get the second beatitude in 13, Revelation 14:13. Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Why is it a blessing? Is because actually we are combining our testimony with Christ's cross testimony, and that's how the unholy Trinity is destroyed. You're totally right, though. There is, even though and I will say, even adding to your Revelation 7 insight, you're exactly right. That measuring, it's a battle imagery, but if I'm going to translate it into the Roman world, he's naming 2 legions per tribe. And Rome usually had around 20 to 26 legions at any given time in the empire, in the Roman Empire, and that would have been 24 legions. Like it is exactly military, but the question isn't, is it a battle? The question is, how do you fight it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we fight it by dying at the Roman swords.
Isn't that great? Revelation 13:10. Yeah.
All right. Do you have just two more minutes? I might ask you one
Absolutely.
more question before
Yeah,
we
fire away.
absolutely wrap up.
Yep.
I'm burning with a question. Have you ever seen this book? And I guess the words are backwards there. It's The Image of God in the Garden of Eden
Oh,
by Catherine McDowell.
that seems super familiar, but I don't know why.
Well, the basic premise of this book is that in the ancient Mesopotamian culture, when they created an idol, they went through a process which they called washing the mouth, which would give the idol breath. It would basically infuse the kind of life into the idol to make it sacred and to make it worth worshiping. There's this whole process called the opening of the mouth ceremony. Mouth washing was part of it, but the opening of the mouth ceremony was this ancient Mesopotamian thing. This book goes through all the details and all the Ugaritic literature and all the ancient literature about how they did it, and different places did it differently in Egypt or in Syria and so on. But it struck me as so similar to the words about the beast from the earth giving breath to the image that was made. And I wondered if there was, in a Roman context, if there was any sort of similar ritual that would give some sort of life or breath to the idols that they made. And had you run across anything like that?
Not a consistent ritual like you're describing. I find that really fascinating. There is in the Temple of Delphi, so you're talking Asia Minor, but a bit away from Ephesus. There was reports of being able to, using a series of mechanisms, to have the oracle actually speak, even though it is coming from a seemingly inanimate object, so an idol. So there is like machinations of that, but a ritual purity parallel, I don't know if I know anything in Rome. I definitely see an echo there of of Genesis chapter 2.
Oh yeah,
where God,
that's
breathes life.
in the Garden of Eden, the
Okay, there
image
you
of
go.
God
Yeah.
in the Garden of Eden. Yeah, that's the next step of this book. Is the image of God creating man out of the dust of the earth and then breathing life into him. Is that a sort of echo of this opening the mouth ritual? But instead of opening the mouth of an idol, he opens the mouth of the Adam,
Well, yeah,
in giving him life.
and that's to me, that imagery is central to really the whole conversation of idolatry, because part of the, even the pushback in Revelation chapter 9, which goes back to Jeremiah, which goes back to Isaiah, is you're worshiping these things that cannot even speak or walk or talk. Like, you're worshiping an icon, an image that actually, and that's where reason why I use that word is because in Colossians 1:15, Jesus is the icon, the image of the invisible God that we were created in, and according to John 1, through. So there's always this collision between idolatry and lack of animation, lack of bearing the image of God. So in a sense, this kind of comes full circle with what we were talking about earlier, and that's, we're always looking into everything for meaning because we're looking for the image of God that we know is in us, that sin is shrouding. And we do the same thing with idols. With idols, it's not that big of a deal if it's just a rock, but it is a big deal if there's something that is animating of it, that we can even say is infused with, or that's why we carve it into images that look like something that is at least discernible to what we understand as created beings in creation. So that movement, that undercurrent, would have definitely been Roman as well, which is why their deities, their temples were not considered places that you went to worship a deity. It was considered the house within which the deity's presence was manifest. And this is where I will say our Western 21st century division between what you can see and cannot see hurts our understanding of what they even thought they were doing with a coin. that had an image of Domitian's face on it, is that there was a part of whatever it was that the image was pointing to that was present in that thing. So an idol of Athena or an idol of Artemis, for example, in Ephesus, would have been considered Artemis, but not the totality of Artemis, but a part of Artemis was present in that, because the physical and the non-physical are just not as separate as what we assume they are. So there is implicit animation, but I cannot think of a formal ritual that would parallel that Mesopotamian aspect, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just may not have uncovered it. But animating or assuming an infusion of the metaphysical with the physical in the idol, that's very Roman. I mean, that's first century Jewish Christian. Like, that's not even just Roman. That's just the way that they thought, which is the reason why the hem of Jesus's robe healed people, or why the shadow of Peter healed people. It's because the physical and the non-physical, as attached to the person itself, is not as separate as what we assume. Well, even letters. Sorry, I'm getting excited. Even when John says epistolary letter, the reason why the name is said at the beginning, an epistolary genre, John to the seven churches, invoking the name invokes the presence of the one that wrote the letter. So in a real sense, the letter itself is an extension of John. It is John's presence among them, even though it's not the totality of his presence. But when they say the name John, they would have been like, we are now in the presence of John, which is why Paul will say later, well, I'm with you there in spirit. Well, how can he say that? Well, it's because the presence of the document is part of him. It came from him. It's the reason why if somebody, and this happens, but people critique my book, even though it's just a piece of paper, it hurts.
Right.
Because it isn't me.
You infused a part of yourself into that book.
Yeah. And the ancients would have understood that same concept in regards to idols, which is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that they're not just worshiping idols, they're worshiping the demons that are behind the idols. He believed there was a physical and a metaphysical component that came together in these rocks. But sometimes they would actually work to make those animated, actual movement.
Right.
But
I've heard something about that. And one of the commentaries I have out of the several on Revelation mentioned those mechanisms, and that maybe breathing life or breath into that image of the beast was something akin to that. But this sounded even more close like it when I was reading about this ancient Mesopotamian practice.
I find that fascinating. And if she does reference anything in Rome or something like that, send it my way. I wish.
I mean, she is so very laser focused on the ancient context and on Genesis and the Garden of Eden. She references 2 verses in the New Testament, and neither one of them are close to what we're talking about in Revelation.
But it doesn't mean it isn't there, right?
Right. Yeah. It's just well. I won't take up any more of your afternoon. I appreciate your time very much, Dr. Wood. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.